The day Earth was summoned before the Galactic Council was supposed to be one of pride. Humanity, after centuries of struggle, had reached beyond its solar system, only to discover that the universe was already carved up and ruled by powers far beyond comprehension. Captain James Jim Brodie stood rigid in his dress uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming under the cold, sterile lights of the council chamber. Around him, representatives of Earth's finest, the politicians, the scientists, the military leaders, fidgeted in uneasy silence. The council chamber was a monolith of alien design, a structure suspended in orbit around a distant star. Its size dwarfed Earth's largest cities, and its alien architecture defied human logic, with surfaces that shimmered and shifted as if alive. At the center stood the counselors, the rulers of the Galactic Empire, a dozen beings from different species whose combined intellect and power had governed the galaxy for millennia. The most imposing of them was Archon Velix of the Zygorans, towering at 9 feet tall, clad in golden armor that seemed to hum with energy. His voice, when he spoke, was both a roar and a whisper, commanding absolute attention. Humans, Velix began, his disdain palpable. You are but children in the cosmos, clinging to primitive tools and fragile ideals. Yet you trespass into our dominion, disturbing the order we have long maintained. The Council has deliberated. Earth is to be annexed into the Empire. A murmur rippled to the human delegation. Jim's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his military training suppressing the storm of anger building inside him. The president of Earth, a thin, stoic man named Harrington, stepped forward to speak. With respect, Archon Velix, Earth seeks only peaceful coexistence. Surely there is room in the galaxy for... Enough! Velix interrupted, his voice booming. Peace? You misunderstand. Your kind will serve. You will surrender all military assets, dismantle your armies, and provide tribute to the Empire. Resistance will not be tolerated. Your compliance ensures survival. Your defiance ensures obliteration. The ultimatum hung in the air, suffocating and absolute. Harrington's lips parted as if to argue, but Jim caught the faintest shake of the president's head, a silent admission of their helplessness. It wasn't the first time humanity had been threatened by a superior force, but it was the first time defeat felt so inevitable. Jim glanced at his team standing behind him. Sergeant Marcus Tank Daniels, his broad shoulders and imposing frame giving him the look of an unshakable fortress, crossed his arms and muttered, "Arrogant bastard." Next to him, Corporal Peter Sparks Jefferson shifted uneasily, his sharp eyes darting across the alien counselors, no doubt already analyzing their technology. Behind them, Private First Class Ethan Rook Harris stood wide-eyed, his youthful face betraying a mix of awe and fear. Jim felt a pang of guilt. Rook was too young to be here, to witness humanity's surrender. The president attempted a final appeal. We ask only for time to transition peacefully into this new reality. Humanity will comply, but we must prepare our people for such a drastic change. Velix tilted his head, as though considering the request. You have one planetary cycle, 30 days, to prove your loyalty and surrender your defenses. Fail, and the Zygoran Armada will raise your planet to ash. With that, the council session ended. The chamber dissolved into a shimmering void, and the human delegation found themselves back aboard their shuttle, the weight of the ultimatum pressing down on them. No one spoke as the shuttle began its return to Earth. Jim stared out the viewport at the endless expanse of stars. For the first time in his life, they felt cold and empty, not full of possibility, but of menace. Back on Earth, the reality of their situation set in. The Zygorans had already stationed their forces in orbit, massive ships casting shadows over entire continents. Their soldiers, biomechanical monstrosities engineered for war, patrolled major cities, their presence a constant reminder of humanity's impotence. In a dimly lit briefing room at a hidden military base in the Appalachian Mountains, Jim and his team gathered to assess their options. The mood was grim. We're being told to lay down our arms and bow like cowards, Tank growled, his deep voice echoing off the concrete walls. "They're treating us like we're already beaten." Sparks leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "Let's face it, we are beaten. Their tech is centuries ahead of ours. Plasma shields, energy weapons, drones. We're throwing rocks at tanks." Rook, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "So what do we do? Just give up?" Jim's gaze swept over his team. He'd known these men for years, fought alongside them in battles that seemed hopeless at the time, but were now laughably small in comparison. They were his brothers, and he wasn't about to let them die for nothing. "We do what we've always done," he said firmly. "We adapt. We survive. And if the time comes, we fight." Tank snorted. "With what?" "Slingshots. Whatever we can get our hands on," Jim replied. His mind raced as he considered their options. "The council thinks we're primitives, that we're not worth taking seriously. Fine. Let's use that to our advantage." Sparks frowned. "What are you thinking, Cap?" Jim leaned in, his voice low and deliberate. "If they're going to underestimate us, we make it their biggest mistake. Somewhere out there, in all the bunkers and depots we mothballed after the wars, there's gear they haven't accounted for. It's not about matching their firepower. It's about finding what they don't see coming." Tank grinned, a wolfish smile that spoke of his eagerness to fight. "Old school warfare. I like it." Rook's expression shifted from fear to determination. "I'm in." Sparks hesitated, then nodded. "It's a long shot, but it's better than rolling over." Jim straightened, his voice taking on the tone of command. "We don't have time to waste. Gather what intel you can. Tomorrow, we start scouring every forgotten armory and cache we can find. If there's even a chance we can hit back, we're taking it." As the men dispersed to prepare, Jim lingered in the room, staring at the map spread across the table. He traced a finger along the Appalachian region, remembering the stories his grandfather had told him about the hidden arsenals left behind after the Cold War. Maybe there was something there. Maybe not. But he knew one thing for sure. Surrender wasn't in his blood. The next morning, under the cover of dawn, the team set out on their first mission. The road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time since they had faced the Galactic Council, Jim felt a flicker of hope. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but they weren't out yet. And if the Zygorans thought humanity would go quietly, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The team moved under the cover of darkness, their destination a remote military depot buried deep within the Appalachian wilderness. Captain James Jim Brody led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the overgrown path ahead. Every sound, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, set his nerves on edge. They had no idea how much of Earth's terrain was already being monitored by the Zygorans, and the looming threat of discovery was a constant companion. Behind him, Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Daniels carried the bulk of their gear with ease, his massive frame seeming to shrug off the weight of their supplies. He muttered curses under his breath as he swatted away gnats. "Next time, Sparks, remind me why we can't just raid a warehouse in the city like normal people." "Because," Corporal Peter Sparks Jefferson replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm, "most of those normal places are being watched by 8-foot-tall alien death machines with plasma cannons. I don't know about you, but I like my limbs where they are." Private First Class Ethan Rook Harris brought up the rear, the youngest and greenest of the group, his rifle held in a tight grip. He didn't speak, but his wide eyes betrayed his unease. Jim glanced back at him. "Stay sharp, Rook. This isn't a training exercise." "Yes, sir," Rook replied, his voice steady despite the fear Jim knew he felt. The depot, when they reached it, was a hulking relic from a bygone era, its concrete walls cracked and overgrown with moss. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, its once imposing warning signs now faded and illegible. Sparks crouched by the gate, pulling out a compact device from his pack and setting to work bypassing the ancient lock. "You sure this place hasn't been cleaned out?" Tank asked, his skepticism evident. "No guarantees," Sparks muttered, his fingers dancing over the device. But the records I hacked said it was decommissioned in the 1980s. It's probably full of junk, but who knows? Maybe we'll get lucky. The lock clicked open, and the team moved inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rust, and their flashlights cut through the darkness to reveal rows of long-forgotten crates and machinery. It was a graveyard of human warfare, filled with relics that had once been cutting-edge but were now little more than curiosities. Tank kicked open a nearby crate, revealing rows of disassembled rifles. M16s, useless against those shields. "Keep looking," Jim ordered, moving deeper into the depot. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, anything, that could level the playing field. Sparks was the first to stumble on the jackpot. Cap? You might want to see this." Jim followed the corporal's voice to a corner of the depot, where Sparks was crouched by a stack of crates marked with faded stenciling. Explosives. Handled with care, inside was an assortment of missiles and rocket-propelled grenades, along with a launcher that looked like something out of a video game. It was bulky and painted in a dull olive green, with an inscription etched onto the side, Spartan. Tank let out a low whistle. "Now we're talking." Jim picked up the launcher, its weight solid in his hands. He'd used plenty of similar weapons during his time in the military, but this one had a brutal elegance to it, like it was built for one purpose and one purpose only, destruction. "Sparks, what's the status on these explosives?" Sparks pulled out a scanner, running it over the contents of the crate. "The warheads are stable, but we'll need to modify them if we want to punch through those shields. Can you do it? Do you even have to ask?" It wasn't long before the sound of distant engines shattered their brief moment of triumph. Jim's hand shot up, signaling silence. The team froze, their ears straining to pinpoint the source. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable hum of Zygoran hovercraft. "They're sweeping the area," Jim said grimly. "We've been made." Tank hefted the newly uncovered launcher with a wicked grin. "Perfect time for a test run." "No!" Jim snapped. "We don't know what kind of attention this thing will attract. Sparks, Rook, grab what you can carry. Tank, set charges on the rest. If we can't take it, no one can." The team moved quickly, working in tense silence as the sound of the hovercraft drew closer. Sparks stuffed a satchel with modified warheads, while Rook hauled a crate of grenades. Tank rigged the remaining crates with explosives, his movements efficient despite the tension in the air. Just as they were about to leave, the depot doors exploded inward. A Zygoran patrol stormed in, their glowing eyes scanning the room. Jim's instincts took over. "Contact! Take cover!" The team scattered, ducking behind crates as plasma bolts sizzled through the air. The Zygorans moved with terrifying precision, their towering forms shrugging off small arms fire like it was nothing. Tank fired off a burst from his rifle, cursing as the rounds bounced harmlessly off their shields. "We're out of options, Cap," Sparks shouted. "Let me use the launcher." "No!" Jim barked. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If Sparks fired and it didn't work, they'd be dead before they could reload. But if they didn't do something, the Zygorans would overwhelm them. Tank solved the problem for him. "I got this," he growled, grabbing the launcher and slamming a missile into place. Before Jim could stop him, Tank stepped out from cover, aimed, and fired. The explosion was deafening, the blast wave knocking Jim back as flames and debris filled the room. When the smoke cleared, the Zygoran soldiers lay in smoldering heaps, their shields shattered. The remaining patrol had retreated, clearly unprepared for such a primitive yet devastating attack. Tank turned back to the group, the launcher resting on his shoulder. "Looks like old school still has some bite." Jim didn't have time to reprimand him. "Move out. They'll be back with reinforcements." As they fled into the forest, Jim's mind raced. They'd just proven that the Zygorans weren't invincible, that their advanced technology could be countered with ingenuity and determination. But it was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, and they'd need more than luck to survive. For the first time in days, though, Jim felt a glimmer of hope. They had a weapon. They had a chance. And that was more than he could have asked for. The air over Washington, D.C. was thick with smoke and fire. The once proud monuments of human achievement reduced to rubble beneath the relentless assault of the Zygoran war machines. The resistance forces, ragged and outnumbered, fought desperately to hold their ground, but the odds were stacked impossibly against them. From his position in the shattered remains of the Lincoln Memorial, Captain James Jim Brodie watched the advancing alien forces through a pair of battered binoculars. 2 more patrols moving in from the east, Jim reported, lowering the binoculars. His voice was steady, but the lines of exhaustion on his face were deep. They've got a tank-class Walker with them. Sergeant Marcus tanked. Daniels leaned on the Spartan rocket launcher, his massive frame covered in grime and ash. That's the 3rd one today, he said, shaking his head. They're not just trying to beat us. They're trying to break us. They won't, Jim replied firmly. He looked over at Corporal Peter Sparks Jefferson, who was hunched over a makeshift workbench, frantically assembling what looked like a small missile. Sparks, how's it coming? Almost there, Cap, Sparks said without looking up. His hands moved with practiced precision, connecting wires and adjusting circuits. The tracker should lock onto their shield emitters. If this works, we can hit them where it hurts. Private First Class Ethan Rook Harris sat nearby, his rifle cradled in his lap. His face was pale, but his jaw was set with determination. What if it doesn't work? He asked quietly. It will work, Sparks snapped, his voice sharp. Then, softening, he added, it has to. Jim glanced at the youngest member of his team, seeing the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Rook, you've been in the thick of this since day one. You're still here because you've got what it takes. Trust your team. Trust yourself. Rook nodded, his grip on the rifle tightening. Yes, sir. The sound of distant explosions grew louder, a clear sign that the Zygorans were closing in. Sparks finished his work, holding up the modified rocket with a triumphant grin. All right, it's done. Who wants to play delivery boy? Tank snorted. Do you even have to ask? Not this time, Jim said, stepping forward. Tank, you're with me. Sparks, Rook, cover our retreat if things go south. Sparks hesitated. You sure about this, Caps? Jim met his gaze. If this plan fails, I need you alive to come up with the next one. That's an order. Reluctantly, Sparks nodded. Understood? The team moved out, slipping through the ruins under the cover of smoke and shadows. Jim and Tank carried the launcher and the experimental rocket, their movements deliberate but swift. The closer they got to the Zygoran patrol, the louder the hum of the Walker's engines became. Its towering frame loomed ahead, bristling with weaponry and encased in an energy shield that shimmered like a mirage. Jim signaled for Tank to take position. They crouched behind a crumbled section of wall, the Spartan launcher resting on Tank's shoulder. Jim loaded the modified rocket, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Remember, Jim said, his voice low, we hit that shield emitter and the whole thing goes down. No second chances. Tank grinned, his teeth gleaming against the soot on his face. I've got this. As the Walker moved into range, Tank took a deep breath and aimed. The launcher fired with a deafening roar, the rocket streaking through the air like a bolt of vengeance. For a moment, it seemed as if nothing would happen. Then the missile struck its target, and the Walker's shield collapsed in a cascade of sparks and light. Direct hit? Jim shouted. Move! The Zygoran patrol reacted instantly, their soldiers opening fire as the Walker's cannon swiveled toward the source of the attack. Jim and Tank sprinted back toward the Lincoln Memorial, plasma bolts scorching the ground around them. Sparks and Rook were waiting, their weapons trained on the advancing enemy. Rook now! Jim ordered. Rook stepped up, his rifle aimed with precision. He fired a burst that struck the Walker's exposed engine, and the massive machine erupted in a ball of fire. The shock wave knocked several Zygorans off their feet and the rest scrambled for cover. The team didn't wait to celebrate. Jim waved them forward, leading the charge to regroup with the rest of the resistance. They reached the rally point just as the Zygorans began to regroup, their forces converging on the human defenders. "Cap," Spark said urgently, "we've got maybe 10 minutes before they hit us with everything they've got. If we're staying, we need to make this count." Jim looked around at the faces of his team, battered but unbroken. He thought of everything they'd lost, everything they'd fought for. The odds were impossible, but that had been true since the day the Council gave its ultimatum. "We hold the line," Jim said, his voice firm. "We show them that humanity doesn't go down easy." Tank grinned, hefting the Spartan launcher. One more round, and Rook nodded, his fear replaced by determination. "Let's do this." Sparks, ever the pragmatist, managed a small smile. No one's going to believe this story. As the Zygorans advanced, the team took their positions, ready to face whatever came next. Jim stood at the forefront, his rifle in hand, his heart steady. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had each other. And sometimes that was enough. The first volley of plasma fire lit up the battlefield, and Jim raised his voice above the chaos. "For Earth! For humanity!" The cry was taken up by the resistance fighters around him, a defiant roar that echoed across the ruins. The Zygorans had given their ultimatum, but humanity had made its choice. They would fight, they would endure, and, if they had their way, they would win.